What is up, most distinguished patrons of this channel? Today I realized it's been over 7 months since I've had a day off, so I figured why not leave the tin shed, take a little bit easy of a day, and share some stuff with you that you probably have never seen. And this little field trip to this field, very peaceful out here, but that's not actually why we're here. We're here for that giant brick building up on the top of the hill, and we're going to look at that up close because one of my passions for the longest time is historic buildings and preserving and restoring them. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Let's get into it. One of the things I realized a long time ago is that people come to this channel from all over the world, and that's pretty amazing because obviously that would have been pretty hard to do 20, 30 years ago, or let alone all of human history. And I thought it'd be cool to share some of the stuff that I like, mainly old derelict buildings, some in better shape than others, because the architecture of it's so awesome and so much of it is from other countries. The influence you'll see on a lot of these buildings I'm going to share with you obviously came from other places than the United States. The United States is a very young country in comparison to most of the world, so people came here and brought their talents, their skills with them and their building styles, and decided to build buildings in this country, and obviously they reflect the buildings from where they came from. So we're going to go on a tour of a bunch of areas of southeastern Wisconsin, and I'm going to share some of my favorite buildings. So for right now, we'll leave this pretty field with the cool building up on the hill, and we're going to look at some buildings in the downtown Milwaukee area of Wisconsin. So for those who don't know already, I live in Wisconsin. My accent is pretty fitting for this area, but in particular, I live in Milwaukee, which is where this arrow is pointed at. Milwaukee's right on Lake Michigan, and it's about an hour and a half north of Chicago. Most of you guys out there probably know where Chicago is. Well, I'm an hour and a half north. Now, Milwaukee was founded in about 1846, so compared to many of you guys where you live, this is basically an infant of a city. But the cool thing is, even though it's not that old in literal sense compared to the rest of the world, a lot of the old world skills and craftsmanship came to Milwaukee in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and it can be seen all over in the influence that it had in the architecture. So let's go and take a look at the first building on the list. I just dropped the red pin for the approximate location, and we're going to look at a basilica that's on the south side of the city of Milwaukee proper. This is a Basilica of St. Josaphat. It's a church. There's going to be a lot of churches on this list simply because the money and time and effort spent on them is an awesome reflection of how much people cared, and therefore they built not grandiose, but significantly higher standard buildings than, say, a home. Anyways, this is the Basilica. It is a mixture of stone, brick, granite, and copper. Awesome building. This picture does not do it justice. It's a dreary day. We've had unseasonably wet spring and summer. It's basically non-stop rain, so this is the best picture you're going to get as far as the dreariness. But seriously though, this is quite an interesting building because when it was built, the neighborhood it was in was probably a little bit more affluent, or not necessarily rich, but better taken care of. And in today's world, it rests in a neighborhood that is pretty poverty-stricken, which is quite interesting because here we have a building that would cost, I don't know, $100 million or more to replicate if you even could. I don't even think the talent exists to build this building today anymore. And then you have very poverty-stricken neighborhoods all around it, so quite the contrast. And that's kind of Milwaukee in general is very similar to that. This is kind of like a metaphor for it. All right, let's look at the front of the building. So a lot of awesome details here. Excellent stonework. There's granite columns. This doesn't really do it justice. Now, I didn't know this until recently, but a lot of these details on this building actually came from a federal post office of some sort down in Chicago in the late 1800s. Apparently 50 or so rail cars worth of material was purchased and then shipped up to Milwaukee to help build this. Originally, this building was not going to be built to look like this. This was an afterthought when the materials came available. So that's something that I don't think you can find anymore. Well, for one, a post office built like this today, and then two, 50 rail cars worth of granite and stone for a reasonable price. Those days are long gone, just like the talent it took to build this. All right, let's take a look at some side shots. Like all old buildings or old people for that matter, they need maintenance. And scaffolding set up here, a building like this is going to be perpetually under maintenance. I mean, it's never going to end. And that's unfortunately why a lot of these old buildings like this end up being razed and destroyed, because the maintenance cost exceeds any reasonable person's or organization's budget to upkeep it. And eventually it falls in such disrepair that the only fate for it, unfortunately, is the wrecking ball and the bulldozer. Luckily, this one has been saved, at least for the time being, but who knows in 100 years if it's still going to be around. And that's kind of the fate of all landmarks. And that's something that this country in the United States doesn't really do a good job on. Once things get older here, the attitude is, screw it, bulldoze it and put something else there that's inferior quality that's only going to last 40 years or something. It's kind of bizarre how that works. So here's the rear of the building, and you can see how immense it actually is by that car that's parked next to it. And it kind of sticks out quite a bit in the neighborhood it's in. It doesn't really reflect the architecture of the homes, which again, so much of it, I guess, is former post office, federal post office from Chicago, so that kind of makes sense. The massive copper dome is quite an amazing feat to have built that in 1900, not to mention it had a working clock on it, which I'm not really too familiar with the clocks on the buildings. My guess is most older buildings had them, because back in the 1900s, it's not like you had an iPhone. Obviously, watches and pocket watches existed, but it would be handy to have a quick reference to just look at neighborhood buildings to know what time it was. And of course, it has church bells as well, I'm sure, that indicate time. On this up-close shot, you can see all the fine details, all the copper roofs. I mean, this thing is quite a feast of skills and engineering and architecture. And of course, you can see the scaffolding there. I gotta say, when I was sitting here taking this picture, I kind of wish that I could be up on that scaffolding doing the restoration work. I spent the better part of 8 years on scaffolding at a building I used to own, fixing it, so this is right up my alley. Presumably, all of the blocks that you see were also hand carved. I mean, these blocks existed prior to 1890 because the building was older than that. That was demoed. So all of this would have been done by hand. Can you imagine that workload? Obviously, a few thousand people took a few years to make all of that. Awesome. Now, the outside of the building is fairly bland as far as color goes, and that's simply because of the stone that they chose to use. The inside is something else, though. Hand-painted murals and artwork, all of the lighting from the windows, because back then I don't even think this thing had electricity in it when it was built. So during the day was the only time you could probably see anything in it, because candles aren't going to light up something with that big of a ceiling. Anyways, it's absolutely gorgeous inside, and if you ever have a chance to tour it or at least stop inside of it, do it. You won't regret it. It's beautiful. Well, now let's look at another building that's only maybe 5-6 blocks north. Here we have another architectural marvel not that far away. This is the St. Stanislaus, I believe that's how you pronounce it. It's Polish church that was built in the late 1800s. So this is actually older than the previous one. It appears to be made out of Cream City brick. And for those of you that are unaware, that brick originated in Milwaukee. The bricks actually started out as a red color, I guess, and then when it was fired in a kiln, the clay turned yellow, so the finished brick was yellow. And as you can see, it has a very yellow appearance overall to the building. Now, interestingly enough, this church would have originally, as in, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago, been pretty black in color, as are a lot of the Cream City brick churches in the city of Milwaukee still, and that's because of all the coal-fired furnaces and power plants that used to exist. All that coal dust ended up settling on a Cream City brick because it's so porous, and it gave an appearance of black brick. So this one has been fully restored, cleaned, and since we don't burn coal for fuel anymore in the average home, it's going to stay more or less that nice golden creamy color for a long time to come. I really like this photo that shows the contrast of the older, more or less artistry of masonry, and then the much more modern, probably built in the 30s, maybe 40s, hard to say, on that building next door that I do believe is actually a school or part of the church. I'm not really sure. But you can see they kind of mimic some of the style. I mean, they put a fake arch and a couple other little details, but one was obviously built by craftsmen, or really, I mean, phenomenally good masons with a backing of a really good architect. And then the more modern buildings is next to it is basically, like, I don't want to say cheap because it's still a very well built building, but you get the point. But yeah, looking at this, I mean, clearly a lot of skilled talent and artistry went into building that church. I really appreciate all the details and all the time that was spent just to make something more than just a flat wall. And that's one of the awesome things you can do with brickwork that you can't do with vinyl siding, is the artistry of it. If you have a dream or an idea, like what you can do with brickwork and masonry is pretty amazing. And this is a testament to that. Even the really cool stone arches above the doors and the stone windows, very cool stuff. I do believe this building was fully restored in the last 7 to 8 years from what I remember. I didn't live on this side of town again until recently, so while it was under restoration, I lived a fair bit south of where this is at, so I wasn't able to keep tabs on it. But judging by how everything looks, I have no doubt that this was fully restored. There's no way that it's over 100 years old and in that good a shape. I can't imagine what the restoration work would have cost on this. I mean, you're talking probably $10 million or more. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would volunteer if I was independently wealthy to go up on scaffolding and work on this sucker for 5, 6, 7, 8 years myself. But most people aren't crazy like I am, I guess. So anyways, the stonework around the windows is phenomenal on this. And this is actually one of many churches in the city of Milwaukee with similar stonework on the windows. I chose to share this one because of its close proximity to where I live, but in the future, if I do another video, I'll have to show you some of the other ones. So the previous church had 4 clocks on the dome. This has 4 clocks on each tower, so that's pretty interesting, and it appears as though they all work. So that's quite interesting. I don't know if they're the original clocks, aka from the 1800s. My guess is the face might be, but the internal workings probably is not. There's far easier ways to make a working accurate clock today than there were in the late 1800s. It's pretty crazy to think that this was built before electricity was even really a common thing, especially in the state of Wisconsin. And OSHA didn't exist, and I guarantee you that this was erected using pine boards and probably 4x4s for the upright posts for scaffolding. And long story short, pretty unsafe and dangerous. And I'll be honest, buildings like this, it wouldn't have been too uncommon to have 1 or 2 people die during construction, especially on bigger buildings than this, simply because of how dangerous it was. Different times, I guess. The restoration work clearly wasn't just on the front of the building, but on the side as well. This thing is in immaculate shape. I mean, for being well over 100 years old. They did a really good job. I'm not really sure who did it, but kudos to them for doing a good job on that. I mean, obviously it cost a fortune, but I can't tell you how irrelevant cost is nowadays for quality. Half the time you pay more money for something, it's still garbage anyways. So anyways, they did a really good job on it, and it's a gorgeous building. If you happen to be in the Milwaukee area, stop by this and take a look at it. So now let's look at something far more modern. So I moved the pin about 2 millimeters to the right, but we moved, I don't know, about a mile or so further north, and we're going to take a look at a far more modern building known as the Allen Bradley Clock Tower, or the home of Allen Bradley, aka the electrical component manufacturer. They do far more than that, but that's what they're probably most known for. So here we have the Allen Bradley headquarters, also known as Rockwell Automation. They got bought out or merged a while ago, so now it's no longer just Allen Bradley. But Allen Bradley's well known to anyone who's been around electrical instruments and breakers and panels and all of that kind of stuff, drives. They produce a ton of stuff for the commercial electrical market, and they do a lot of robotic stuff as well. This building is probably one of the most well-known in the city of Milwaukee, simply because you can see the face of the clock tower from all over the city, basically anywhere on a bridge for the most part. There's also a thermometer on a tower that's next to this one, and it's pretty accurate too, which is a bonus. But this building itself, I'm not exactly sure how old it is. The clock tower itself was erected in 1962. I believe the building, or at least parts of the building, are a bit older than that. So by the standards that we've seen so far in buildings, this is far more recent. And to be honest, it's not like an architectural marvel by any means, but it's very distinguishable and everyone knows it, whether or not they know the name, simply by driving past it on the freeway. Interestingly enough, until 2010, this had the biggest four-sided clock in the world. So from 62 till 2010, it held the record. Yes, it was bigger than Big Ben, believe it or not. To give you a sense of scale here and how big this is, it's multiple city blocks big. You can actually drive under the building complex on this street right here. A few years ago, this whole building complex underwent general maintenance, and they ended up filling cracks in the exterior and painting it. So it's actually in pretty decent shape. There really isn't a whole lot more to share about this, I guess, so let's look at some more cool buildings. So I've moved the pin a little bit towards the east, closer to the lake. This is an approximate position of this building. I'm probably off by a little bit, but you get the idea. We're going to look at the Mitchell building. So here we have the Mitchell building, which was erected in 1876. Now the Mitchell building is the building that's closest to the camera. The building on the other side of it is actually a different building, the one with the clock tower, both of which were designed by the same architect. This building has probably the most amount of little details in stone that I've seen on a building in the whole city. It's pretty amazing. And obviously the architect had a particular style, since both of these buildings look very similar and they complement each other nicely. If I'm not mistaken, these two buildings are one of probably less than 5 that are left in this country that are of this architectural style. So pretty rare and not likely to see many of them like this. It was fully restored exterior-wise a number of years ago at the cost of, I think, 10 or 12 million, and the building next door was, I guess, 15 million. So you're talking $25 million just to restore the exterior of both of those buildings. Pretty insane on the cost. Now this is a full masonry stone building. There's not really much brickwork that you can see, at least. It's mainly block and stone. And again, would have been done by hand, because when it was built, power tools didn't exist. So a massive undertaking. This is the only picture I took of this building simply because it's on an extremely busy street downtown, and my motorcycle probably would have been ticketed and towed had I spent any more time parked illegally to get this photo. So let's take a look at where the City of Milwaukee tax dollars go. So now we're going to move over to where the drop pin is, which is a bit west of where we just were, and we're going to check out the City of Milwaukee Town Hall. So here is the City Hall of Milwaukee, and all your property tax payments in the city actually go to this building. It's basically a multi-level office building. I believe the mayor's office is in there along with a lot of other higher ups in the city. It's actually a pretty gorgeous building, and it's cost a fortune both to build originally and the restoration of it, which was completed a number of years ago. It's had a lot of issues over the years with the foundation and settling and all sorts of brickwork problems even after restoration. It's funny, when I was taking these pictures, I honestly didn't notice there's literal clocks on all of these older buildings. I find that funny that I didn't catch that. But you can see this building has a clock face. It's on all four sides, and it's a primarily brick building. A lot of cool architectural details on this. The whole exterior was completely restored in the last 10 years along with parts of the foundation at a cost of a cool $60-70 million. And not only that, apparently they need about another $80 million to fully stabilize the foundation. My understanding is the wood pilings it's built on turn to dust because they dry out. And then, of course, you have settling issues that result from that. And obviously, it's pretty hard to go and tear up a foundation on a building like this without it falling down. So the work would be pretty expensive, thus the additional $80 million price tag. At least that's what they claim. You know it's going to be over budget for sure. The architectural style of this building is pretty rare in the United States, and this is actually one of the finest examples you'd probably find anywhere. Most of the historic landmarks in the city of Milwaukee have actually been bulldozed. The churches remain and the city hall remains, but a significant number of buildings and homes have all met the bulldozer wrecking ball in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And people have come to realize that once you bulldoze something like, say, this building, it's lost forever. And there's been a really big push in the last 40 to 50 years on preserving buildings like this for future generations, which I'm pretty glad about, even though it did cost a fortune in taxpayer money to rehab this building to where it's going to last another 100 years. I can't imagine when it needs it again what the cost might be. Exceptional brick and stonework, nice columns. Everything about this is first class. The multiple arches here on the front corner of the building are pretty awesome. This doesn't do it justice. They're absolutely massive. Speaking of those arches, here's a historic photo of guys actually building the sucker. And as you can see, no tie-offs, no ropes, no hard hats, basically cigars, pipes, probably a little bit of beer in you too, and that's what it took, along with cranes, pulleys, ropes, to build that whole building. I couldn't find the photos in time to make this video, but I had a bunch of historic photos of the construction of the roof of the building, and it was pretty amazing to see just a bunch of wooden planks, and you being the highest person basically anywhere in the city due to how tall the building was, and people just standing there with a smile on their face working, and no tie-offs, no safeties, nothing, no hard hats, like I said earlier. Pretty wild. In this photo you can see how massive it really was when it was built. I mean, it towers over everything else around it, and most of the city didn't really exist like it does today. I mean, you can see clear into the horizon, and you can also see all the smokestacks and likely coal dust in the air when this was shot. Pretty amazing that such things could be built without a power tool and just with ingenuity, ropes, pulleys, and a bunch of beer in your stomach. In case you're wondering, this is what the inside looks like, and it's completely open from the bottom floor all the way up in the center. Not exactly a great use of space. Obviously, it wasn't air conditioned when it first opened. I doubt it had electricity beyond a certain point, so all of that would have been retrofitted after the fact. But all those hand railings are wrought iron or copper. Pretty amazing. So with our tax bill paid in full, we're going to take a trip over to the left side of the screen there. I dropped a pin. It's actually quite a bit further left than what you see there. I just couldn't fit it in on this picture. And we're going to take a look at a pretty unusual building, and you'll see what I mean by that. So this isn't the building that we're going to go and take a look at, but I saw this along the way, and I don't know anything about this, and I didn't record what the name of this building was. Clearly it's a church of some sort, or was, but pretty cool. And you can find stuff like this all over the city of Milwaukee, and I had a pretty good laugh considering it has 4 clock faces again on it. I guess that was just the hot thing to do back then. So this has to be one of the most unusual buildings you would find in any city, and I would definitely say it's got to be up at least top 3 in the city of Milwaukee. And I want you to take a good look at it and take a guess as to what this is. No, it's not for a lady to put her hair down from the top window. It's a former water tower. My understanding is they used to have giant pumps that would pump lake water from a much lower elevation up, and because the pumps had a pulsation, essentially what this worked as is a water hammer arrestor / water storage. So it kind of smoothed out the pulsation of the giant pumps they used to have. So pretty cool engineering for the late 1800s, and likely why they spent so much effort to make it look pretty. Not to mention, I read that they were over budget by quite a bit, $8,000 in late 1800s money, and the actual finished completed project was probably over 40,000. So that's a pretty serious miscalculation, but it was well worth it considering how beautiful it is. In this photo you can see how tall it is, and it's actually pretty hard to get a photograph of it because of its unusual proportions. But everything about this I really like. The amount of detail and work that went into something as simple as a water tower is pretty amazing. But you got to remember, back when this was built, having a water tower and pressurized water system was probably state of the art. It would have been the iPhone of its day, I guess. I mean, it certainly would have beat taking river water back home in buckets and probably getting Giardia or something. Then again, it still held Lake Michigan water, which probably wasn't that much cleaner than the river, to be honest. Well, it's time to make one more stop on the scooter and look at a museum of sorts before we head back to that big old church on the hill. So here's a picture overlooking Lake Michigan, right next to the water tower we just saw. It's beautiful here on a calm day. So here is part of the Milwaukee Art Museum. This is only part of it. It's actually a 3 or 4 building complex, but this is the most newest, bestest part, I guess. It was built in 2001, and I guess is fairly world-renowned for its architecture. What appears to be wings on the structure actually open and close depending on weather conditions. If it's windy, they automatically shut. If it's very calm like today, they're open. But the art museum itself and all the structures besides this one house an immense amount of art, and I've spent quite a bit of time at this place. I remember going here on a field trip in the 1st or 2nd grade, and I didn't really understand anything about art, but I did understand metals, and they had a sphere, and I'll put a picture of it up now, that I looked at as a kid, and I don't know why, but I was just fascinated by it. Like, the rest of the artwork for the most part really didn't do much for me, but this cast bronze and alloy sphere really inspired me. I don't know. Maybe you could say I was born to work with metal or something, but I kind of find it funny that for the rest of my life I've always had an interest in metalworking, and here I am running a YouTube welding channel many, many years later and still having that interest in metalworking, much like I did when I was very young. All right, well, I think we've seen enough of Milwaukee's landmarks. Let's head back to that church up on a hill. As promised, we are back at our original location at the cool church on the hill. Seriously though, this area is called Holy Hill, as you could imagine you would call an area with a church on top of a hill. But this is a pretty awesome place, and I really like this building, and it's pretty amazing to think of the amount of work it would have taken to build this in the location that it's at. It's not the most ornate church, or building for that matter, I mean, the brickwork is pretty good, and it has copper and slate roofs, which is awesome. But the views here are second to none in this area of Wisconsin. And you'll see what I mean when I share the pictures. So let's start going through them right now. So to start things off, this is a side of the building. You hike up a bunch of steps, and this is basically the first thing that you're going to see. It's a pretty massive structure, and it has two towers. Obviously, this is one. There's an identical one opposite of it. Here's an up close of the tower on the top. That's all copper, the whole thing, 100% copper. In case you're wondering, when copper oxides over time, it turns green. That patina is basically an oxide layer that protects the copper from oxygen. In certain instances, mainly in the exposure of chlorine gas, among other chemicals, copper can also oxide blue. And blue copper is probably my favorite color of all time. I believe that this was either leaded or silver soldered together. I'm not really sure. If you have an opinion on it, feel free to leave it in the comments. I'll have a close-up picture of it later. So not as ornate as some of those other churches I showed you, but it makes up for that in sheer size and location. Now, I'm not sure if this had exterior renovation done on this section. I know that the towers themselves had a lot of restoration work on both the inside and the outside, but I couldn't really find a whole lot of information regarding this side or much of the building, I guess. I do know that it's made from identical bricks that a school I used to own was made out of, and those bricks are basically hard as a coffin nail and not porous at all. So 100 years old is barely breaking a sweat for them because they don't tend to break or absorb moisture. And that's what kills buildings like this, is when you have a porous brick and it absorbs moisture, and then that moisture freezes in winter, it spalls the bricks and all the mortar out. So the bricks that they chose to make this out of was a really smart and wise decision, because this building will last a lot longer than some of the other churches that we saw earlier. Here is a view from just the base of the front door of the building, and you can see that it's quite a view. You can see for miles in a bunch of directions here. Let's take a look at the front of the building. So this is the front entrance, and is exactly opposite of that view we just saw. And you can see the awesome stonework here, both towers. The one on the right is the one that we can climb, and I will be climbing it later, even though my knees didn't like it. But a lot of cool details here, and very similar to some of the other churches that we saw, but obviously this is the only one made out of red brick that I know of in the area. Here's more of an up close of the towers. The one on the right is open to the public for climbing. The one on the left holds some cell phone tower stuff, I guess. Hey, I guess the church needs to make money somehow to pay for this place. I can't even imagine what the costs are associated with keeping this place standing. Here's an up close of that front door, and you see the nice stonework that interlocks with the bricks perfectly. Clearly a highly skilled mason did this, and this would have been carved by hand as well. It's kind of sad that this kind of skill is probably going to be lost pretty soon in this country. Very few people do this kind of work anymore. Here's an up close of the tower. It does have a slate roof. It also has a copper cable and a lightning rod, because I could imagine this gets struck by lightning at least once every couple years for sure. I don't believe that the opening there ever held windows in it. I would have to take a look at historical photos, but I believe that was always open. Well, let's take a trip up the tower, and hopefully my knees will hold out. So the first staircase that you're going to find is this guy right here, which wouldn't meet any modern code for a staircase, that's for sure. I'm a pretty big guy at 6'6", and my shoulder was rubbing the white wall on the right side walking up and on the staircase on the left, so it's a pretty tight squeeze in here. This is a view at the first landing, and we're already higher than the treetops because this building is essentially at the top of the hill. There's copper grounding wires that run from the staircase onto the grate on the window and all over the tower. Again, I think that's for lightning protection to give a path to ground. Pretty interesting. This is a big round window that you saw from the ground level. I don't know if this ever held glass. Judging by how it looks, I doubt it did. But the view out of this, being only 2/3 up, is pretty amazing. The brickwork in this place is definitely on point. I didn't bring a level, and I actually do that sometimes when I look in old buildings just to see how good they were when they built it. But I have a feeling that everything in this place is pretty close to plumb true level. And that's one of the hardest things to achieve. Like, perfection on a small scale is one thing, but extremely close to perfection on a large scale takes an immense amount of effort and skill. At this point, we're on all metal stairs, and I know a 6010 weld when I see one, and 100% this was welded with 6010. A funny backstory regarding this staircase: when I went to this place as a kid, when my father brought me here, the staircase that was here was straight up dangerous, unbelievably bad. And this has all been fully restored with a new staircase and something that's far less janky. I remember even my father said that he was a little bit worried about the staircase that used to be in this place, and he almost fell off of buildings and kind of laughed it off. So that ought to tell you how sketchy this used to be, 30 years ago or more. So I finally hit the top part where you are basically on an observation deck. These window gratings never used to be there. They just used to be wide open. I don't really mind this. I mean, it keeps people from falling out of it, which is a plus, I guess. You basically have a 360-degree view of the area here. To start out, let's look at the central tower here. We're a little bit taller than this, but this is all copper. Pretty cool looking up close. At first I thought that was white silicone, but I don't think it is. I think it's like silver solder or something. This picture's pretty bad, but I had another up-close photo, and I looked at it pretty closely, and I don't believe that that is silicone. I don't know. If you have an opinion on it, feel free to leave it in the comments. Here's a view directly to the left of that central tower. Here's a second tower that you can't climb. It appears that there's like a cell phone tower or something antenna in there, but quite ornate stonework. I like the slate roof. How would you like to roof that? To be honest, I would probably sign up to do that, or at least when I was younger. Nowadays, I'd definitely fall off trying to roof that, even with a tie-off on the top. A little bit closer of a view there. Gorgeous. Well, to complete our journey here, why don't we do a few welding inspections. This guy right here wasn't bad. It actually looks worse than it is. And they were smart and welded both sides of it, so I give that an A. This right here looks worse than it actually was. It was pretty clean, so this I'd give a solid B minus maybe. I don't know what they're doing with all the rebar there. Believe it or not, a lot of rebar really isn't weldable, and it makes brittle welds that just break off, so I don't know. We'll give that a B minus. And this guy right here might be hard to see. The welds are so clean that I thought this was a TIG welded aluminum bar, but I kind of knocked on it, and it's definitely steel. I don't know what they welded it with, because it 100% looked like really big aluminum TIG welds. So this is definitely an A plus for me. They did a really good job on these. In case you're wondering on what the inside of the building looks like, here's a picture of it. It's not quite as ornate as some of the other churches that I showed pictures of, but it's still pretty amazing in its own right. Tons of light, and the stained glass, I'm sure, is exquisitely done. Definitely worth a visit. Here's the best time of the year to go and visit this place, is in fall when all the leaves on the trees turn. It's something else. It's really a work of art, both the building and the landscape that they chose to build it on. Well, this pretty much wraps up our journey. I'm going to go to one of my favorite hangout spots, and I'll finish this video up. Well, thanks for coming along for my journey on my day off, checking out some of my favorite places. And if you're into old buildings and restoring things, hopefully you have an appreciation for some of the cool old buildings that you saw today. Now, I'm not religious in the least, and I don't really go to church, but I do have a solid appreciation for cool old brick buildings. And one of my biggest fears is a lot of what you saw in this video today, especially the older buildings, aren't going to be around in another 100 years. And it really stresses the importance of sharing skills with the younger generation and inspiring them to pick up tools and try and fix things. Because if someone doesn't pick up where we left off, they're not going to have anything that we built and the people before us built. And that's really a loss for everyone. So with that said, thanks for sticking around. Until next time.